At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson sat in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress, nicknamed Mizpah, watching black clouds of flak explode across the sky over Budapest. He was 24 years old. He had 17 combat missions behind him, and today he had zero margin for error. Down below, around the rail yards and the refinery complex, the Germans had built a ring of steel. Heavy guns, timed fuses, overlapping arcs. And when those guns speak, they don't sound like bullets. They sound like the sky tearing open. Swanson's B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, flying out of Sterparone, Italy. The mission was simple on paper. Hit the oil, hit the rail, cut the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, then turn south, get over Yugoslavia, get to the Adriatic, and get home. But by July of 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force knew the real math. You could have the best airplane in the world, the best crew in the world, and one burst of flak could still rewrite your life in a single second. And that's exactly what happened to Mizpah. Because at 9:43 a.m., less than a minute after Swanson watched that flak curtain bloom, an 88mm shell found the nose of his bomber, and everything forward of the cockpit ceased to exist. Not cracked, not broken, gone. Let me slow this down for a second, because if you don't understand the world these crews lived in, you won't understand why what happened next feels like science fiction. Strategic bombing isn't just bombs falling. It's a production line of life. You take off in the morning with 10 men. You come back in the afternoon if you're lucky. And if you're unlucky, someone's bed stays made. By mid-1944, crews in Italy knew the score. They weren't flying a mission. They were flying a lottery ticket where the prize was survival. And it wasn't only death. There was a worse outcome that haunted every man in those bombers. Capture. Because capture meant months or years inside a wire world you couldn't escape, while the war raged without you. You were alive, but you were removed from life. And this was the cruel joke. A B-17 was designed to be tough. It was designed to absorb punishment. But flak wasn't about toughness. Flak was about math and timing. It was designed to shred planes that were doing the one thing bombers had to do: fly straight. So the formation pressed forward into that curtain, black puffs that could shred aluminum like paper. Fragments that didn't need to hit you directly to kill you. And Mizpah took hits, first the tail section, then the wings. Shrapnel punched holes through the fuselage like a giant shotgun blast. But the bomber stayed in formation, because formation is discipline, and discipline is survival. Behind Swanson, the crew held their positions. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt sat in the co-pilot seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the compartment beside him. Throughout the aircraft, radio operator, gunners, flight engineer. Each man was a small piece in a machine that weighed tens of thousands of pounds, moving at nearly 200 miles an hour, 5 miles above the earth. And people forget what 30,000 feet really means. It means the air is thin. It means the temperature can be 40 below zero. It means if you lose oxygen, you don't feel sleepy. You become stupid. Then you die. You wear gloves, but the metal still bites you. You wear layers, but the cold still finds a way in. And the sound is constant. 4 engines pounding like a drumline, wind screaming around the fuselage. Intercom chatter crackling with static. Every mission is sensory overload. And then the bomb run begins. Seconds away from the target, Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of high explosive dropped toward the rail yards below. Mizpah lurched upward as the weight fell away. And then the sky punched back. At 9:43 a.m., an 80mm shell hit the nose of the aircraft. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire front section of Mizpah vaporized. The nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator position, the Norden bomb site, plexiglass panels, everything forward of the cockpit simply ceased to exist. Dudley died instantly. Henderson died instantly. And that's the part that should make you angry, if you're a normal human being. Because those two men didn't die after a long fight. They didn't get a chance. They were alive in 1 second and absent in the next. The blast wave tore through what remained of the aircraft. The metal structure that had housed two men and thousands of pounds of equipment was gone. The center of gravity shifted backward like someone yanked the airplane by the spine. With no weight in the nose, Mizpah pitched up into a near-vertical climb. The bomber began to stall. And Swanson looked forward and saw a sky where his instruments should have been. Cold air at 30,000 feet screamed through the open cavity. The temperature was 40 below. Wind tore at his flight suit. And blood from the blast, covered the flight deck. Here's what that means in real terms. The cockpit wasn't open. It was missing. The airplane wasn't damaged in the normal way. It was amputated, and every rulebook says you don't fly an amputated bomber. There was no control column. The yoke that connected to the flight control system had been mounted to the forward structure. That structure no longer existed. There were no instruments. The panel had been attached to the nose section. That was gone too. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon. No way to know what the aircraft was doing except by feel and by looking at the horizon through the massive hole in front of him. And if you've never flown, let me explain why that's terrifying. Your body lies to you in the air. Without instruments, you can feel like you're level when you're not. You can feel like you're climbing when you're actually descending. You can feel like you're steady when you're slowly rolling into a death spiral. So Swanson is sitting inside a ripped-open flight deck, with wind trying to pull him out of the airplane. And he has to do something that doesn't make sense. He has to get the nose down. Because if he doesn't, they stall. And a stalled bomber at 30,000 feet isn't a problem. It's a funeral. Swanson forced the B-17's nose down. He did not know how. There was nothing to push, nothing to pull. But somehow he got the aircraft level. Somehow he got it back into a loose, staggering approximation of formation. And that moment, those seconds, are the hinge of the entire story. Because if he fails there, nobody bails out. Nobody survives. But the control cables were still there. The steel cables that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They were exposed now, hanging in the wind. But they were intact. That matters more than people realize. Because a B-17 isn't fly-by-wire. It's literally wire. Steel cable routed through pulleys and fair leads. When you move a control, you're pulling tension through metal lines that run the length of the fuselage. And now those lines were out in the open, getting hammered by slipstream. Think about that for a second. It's like trying to steer a speeding truck by grabbing the steering linkage underneath the chassis while it's moving. That's the level of madness we're talking about. And somewhere behind Swanson, the surviving crew members began moving forward. The radio operator, the flight engineer. They could see the exposed cables running through the bomb bay. They could see the wind tearing through the aircraft. And they understood what had to happen next. Because the airplane wasn't being controlled anymore in the normal way. It was being controlled by whatever was left. Physics, desperation, and the last intact parts of a machine that had just been blown apart. If you want to see how Swanson's crew pulled those bare cables to stay airborne, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories that were almost erased. And if you haven't already, subscribe to WWII Hidden Chapters, because the next time YouTube opens, I want you to see another story like this waiting for you. All right, back to Mizpah. At 9:44 a.m., another 88-meter burst caught Mizpah again. This time punching into the right side, chewing up an engine. A radial engine doesn't break. It explodes. Oil atomizes. Metal fragments scatter like knives. Flame streaks back along the wing. The prop windmilled for a few seconds, then seized. Engine number 2 was dead. Now Mizpah had 3 engines instead of 4. And you can feel what happens next, even if you've never flown. The bomber begins to lose airspeed. The formation begins to pull ahead. And without instruments, Swanson has no way to measure how fast they're falling behind. He can only feel it in the aircraft's sluggish response, and in the distance growing between him and the other bombers. This is where doctrine turns cold. Bombers don't wait for crippled aircraft, because every minute over the target box is more exposure, more flak, more fighters. So at 9:46 a.m., Mizpah is alone. The formation is a mile ahead, then 2 miles, then a cluster of dark shapes shrinking into distance. And now Swanson is flying the most dangerous kind of aircraft in WWII, a lone crippled bomber. No mutual support, no overlapping guns, just one wounded machine, bleeding speed and altitude over hostile ground. Technical Sergeant Frank Gramenzi, the flight engineer, crawled forward. He could see the problem immediately. The control cables ran through the fuselage in bundles. Elevator cables, rudder cables, aileron cables. Steel wire rope, thick enough to bite through gloves. Normally they're tucked away, guided by pulleys and hidden structure. Now they're exposed, and the slipstream is yanking them like a violent hand. Without someone physically holding them steady, the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. So men move into position near the bomb bay where the main cable runs are visible. No discussion, no debate. The situation is obvious. Someone has to hold these cables. Someone has to pull them when Swanson needs control input. And here's the worst part. Coordination. Swanson is sitting forward. The crew is back near the bomb bay. The intercom is damaged. Communication is nearly impossible. So what do? They do what combat crews always do when technology fails. They improvise a new system instantly. Hand signals, shouted cues, physical rhythm, and then they begin pulling. They wrap sections of cable around their hands for grip. The steel is cold. It cuts into their gloves, and the feedback is immediate. Pull left on the rudder cable. Mizpah's nose drifts left. Pull right. She drifts right. Elevator's the same. Pull back. Nose rises. Release. Nose drops. And the problem is timing. Too much pressure, and the aircraft overresponds. Too little, and nothing happens. And they're doing this without seeing what Swanson is seeing, without knowing what corrections he needs, without instruments. So they learn by feel. They become the control system, a living, sweating, freezing hydraulic system made out of human hands and muscle. This is not flying. This is collective survival through brute force. 10 men working as a single organism to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. And every second, the aircraft is still descending. 30,000. 29. 28. Not a dive. Worse. A steady, unstoppable bleed of altitude. Now the fuel situation is unknown. The gauges are gone with the instrument panel. Swanson has no idea how much gasoline remains in the wing tanks. No idea how long 3 engines can keep them airborne. No idea if they're even heading the right direction. Navigation requires instruments. It requires a map. It requires a navigator. And the navigator is dead. All Swanson knows is a desperate compass of survival. Southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Get to the Adriatic. Get to Italy. Get home. And then, another problem. The crew in the bomb bay starts waving frantically toward the rear. Something is wrong back there. Something beyond the missing nose, beyond the dead engine, beyond the exposed control cables. The tail gunner, isolated at the very back, can feel it. The tail structure is flexing. The metal framework holding the stabilizers is moving in ways it shouldn't. Stress fractures, shrapnel damage, a hidden crack turning into a tear. And if the tail comes off, everyone dies instantly. A B-17 without a tail doesn't crash. It tumbles. It disintegrates. There's no time to bail out. No time to think. So now the crew is fighting 2 clocks at once. The altitude clock and the structural clock. And every minute they stay inside that aircraft is a gamble that gets worse. Swanson makes a decision. Get the crew out, because the aircraft is dying. The tail is failing. Fuel is unknown, and they're still over occupied territory. Every minute in the air increases the chance of total structural failure. If Mizpah breaks apart at altitude, No one survives. But if the crew bails out while the aircraft is still controllable, most of them have a chance. They'll be captured. They'll spend months in POW camps. But they'll be alive. The problem is execution. Bailing out of a B-17 requires choreography, specific exit points, specific order. Training assumes the aircraft is intact. Training assumes the intercom works. Training assumes the pilot can command it. Swanson has none of that, and he can't leave his seat. If he unbuckles, the aircraft becomes uncontrolled. The crew loses reference for which cable to pull. The bomber enters a dive or spin. Everyone still aboard dies. So the crew makes the decision themselves. One by one, they move toward the waist windows, and as each man jumps, the aircraft becomes harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables means less precision. The B-17 begins wallowing, wings dipping left, then right, the nose pitching up slightly. Swanson tries to compensate with throttle, but throttle alone isn't enough. He needs rudder. He needs elevators. He needs the crew pulling cables. But the crew is abandoning ship. They have to. It's the only rational choice. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men have evacuated. 5 parachutes bloom over Yugoslavia like pale flowers. 5 men drift away from a bomber that is still trying to die. And this is the cruel, beautiful irony. The same wind that is tearing the airplane apart is now the wind holding these men up. Now it's Swanson, burnt, and a handful still aboard. Altitude dropping. Tail flexing. No control system. Just leftover stability and engine power. And then Burnt looks at Swanson. No words. Wind noise would drown them out anyway. But the message is clear. Burnt needs to go. He has no controls. No instruments. No function. If he stays, he dies. So Burnt unbuckles, moves aft, reaches the waist exit, looks back one last time, and jumps. And now Swanson is alone, one man in a dying bomber. The aircraft is falling at roughly 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, a steady descent. 3 engines still running, enough thrust to keep forward speed, not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose creates massive drag. The aerodynamic profile is destroyed. The B-17 is essentially a flying brick with wings. Swanson estimates. He guesses airspeed. He guesses distance. He guesses direction. And then he makes one final decision. He stays with the aircraft for 2 more minutes. Not because he thinks he can save it, but because those 2 minutes give his crew more separation. If the bomber crashes, German patrols will search the crash site. But if the crew lands miles away from that site, that separation might mean the difference between capture and evasion. It's a thin hope. But in war, thin hope is still hope. So Swanson holds it together. 2 more minutes. Hands locked on throttles. Eyes forward. Wind trying to rip him toward the open hole where the cockpit used to be. Then at 10 a.m. exactly, he lets go. He unbuckles. The moment the straps come loose, the wind pressure tries to pull him forward. He pushes back, stands up carefully, and the aircraft immediately begins to pitch. Without corrections, Mizpah starts a gentle roll. Swanson moves fast. He squeezes through the narrow crawlway. Behind him, the bomber's nose drops. The control cables hang loose in the bomb bay. Nobody is holding them now. Nobody is flying. Swanson feels the aircraft accelerating. He has maybe 30 seconds before the dive steepens, before the G-forces pin him, before the bomber enters a spin. He reaches the waist gun area. The floor vibrates under his boots. He grabs his parachute pack, clips it in, and then he jumps. The slipstream hits him like a physical wall. It spins him sideways. The bomber flashes past, engine still roaring, already pulling away downward. Swanson pulls the ripcord. The chute deploys with a violent jerk. Then silence, relative silence, and Swanson watches Mizpah fall. The tail is barely attached. The rear fuselage flexing like a reed. At 15,000 feet, the tail separates. The forward section pitches down almost vertically. It falls another 8 seconds, then disappears into trees. A column of black smoke rises. The fuel tanks ignite. Nothing survives that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson stayed aboard 30 more seconds, he'd be dead. The parachute descent is slow. Swanson drifts. Below him, farms, forests, villages. Somewhere down there, German occupation forces. Somewhere down there, his crew. And somewhere down there, the reality that his war is over. He's about to become a prisoner. He tries to steer toward an open field. But the canopy isn't designed for precision. Trees rise to meet him. He hits branches at about 15 miles an hour. The parachute catches. He slams into a thick limb and feels his leg break. Pain detonates. He hangs there, tangled, bleeding, suspended. Then he hears voices, German voices. Soldiers arrive within minutes. They bring a ladder. They cut him down. A medic splints his leg, wraps his cuts, injects morphine. And Swanson's world narrows to one brutal truth. He survived the impossible in the sky, only to lose his freedom on the ground. Within days, the rest of the crew is captured. 8 survivors, alive, beaten by time. Now they're POWs. People imagine POW camps like a single image, barbed wire and guards. But the real punishment is time. Days that don't end. Nights that don't rest. Hunger that becomes normal. Cold that becomes routine. And boredom that becomes dangerous because it gives your mind time to replay the worst moments of your life over and over. Swanson's leg heals, slowly, painfully. He goes from a cast to crutches to limping laps along a perimeter that feels like a planet. The crew talks about the mission. They talk about the 88mm shell. They talk about the 10 minutes without a cockpit. They talk about pulling steel cables by hand. They talk about Dudley and Henderson, 2 men erased in a blink, and they wait. Then late in the war, everything gets worse. Camps evacuate. Columns move. Marches begin. Food disappears. Men die on roads. Some escape in chaos. Most don't. The war keeps grinding right up until the moment it ends. And even then, freedom doesn't arrive like a movie. It arrives like exhaustion, like a door opening after you forgot doors could open. Finally, April 1945, liberation. A dirt road. Tanks. Cigarettes. Water. The first full breath of being alive and not owned. 9 months of captivity ends, and the crew goes home. Swanson returns to Michigan. He marries, raises a family, builds a life that the flak almost stole. And like so many men, he doesn't talk about it much. Because how do you explain 10 minutes with no cockpit to someone who has never felt -40 air clawing through a hole where your plane's face used to be? How do you explain the moment you realize you're holding a 65,000-pound bomber in the air with nothing but will, in the hands of your crew pulling cables like they're hauling a ship through a storm? The B-17 earned its reputation through engineering. Yes, big wing, rugged frame, redundancy. But Mizpah is a different kind of lesson. The airplane is a machine. Survival is a team sport. And war is not heroic. War is brutal arithmetic. 2 dead instantly, 8 captured. A bomber destroyed. And a story so impossible that people still argue about the details. And honestly, let them argue, because argument keeps memory alive. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to WWII Hidden Chapters and turn on notifications. Because we're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. And drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? United States, UK, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the world, and you're part of keeping these memories alive. And if someone in your family served, tell us that too, not for clout, for respect. Because on July 14th, 1944, 2 men, Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson, were erased instantly by one 88mm burst. They never came home, but 8 men did. 8 men who held a dying bomber in the sky long enough to live. And now, through this story, their names don't disappear into silence. Thanks for watching.